Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. I'm Paul Harrison, and on behalf of the Ho Centre for Buddhist Studies, the Department of Religious Studies, the Silk Road Foundation, and the Stanford Humanities Centre, I'd like to welcome you to the 39th Evans Wentz Lecture, a series named after Stanford alumnus Walter Evans Wentz, who was a pioneer in the study of the Buddhist religion and Buddhist literature. Tonight, our guest speaker is another pioneer. Buddhism and the study of Buddhism has developed in all sorts of interesting and unexpected directions in the last few decades, and nobody has been more active than our speaker in exploring, or rather leading, the exploration of some of the uncharted territory. Professor Richard Solomon is Professor of Sanskrit at the University of Washington and director of that university's Early Buddhist Manuscript Project. He is one of the world's foremost authorities on Indian epigraphy and paleography, and without doubt the leading authority on Gandhari language and literature in the world. It is with great pleasure that I welcome him here today and invite him to address us on the subject of retrieving the Buddhist canon at Bamiyan. Professor Solomon.
I wanted to start with a little bit of reminiscence, if you'll indulge me. There's a second reason that I get special pleasure in being able to deliver the Evans Wentz lecture, and so I'm stressing that in this emended title page. The reason that this has a certain special meaning to me is that this is a book which I pulled off my shelves, which I had in 1967. I first came across this book in a hippie hovel in New York's Lower East Side at the tender age of 19, where I stumbled into a little group, a Buddhist discussion group, where we learned about Buddhism, did other 1960s-ish things, but that's all behind me. And this book was brought to my attention, and I bought it, and I had it ever since. I actually read it. I hardly understood any of it, I think, at the time, but it was had a very major influence on me, and basically it pointed me in a different and better and more productive direction than the one that I was heading for at that particular time. So I have a special feeling for W.Y. Evans Wentz. He put me on the proper path. And then I read a bunch of other books, and all sorts of things happened, and nearly 50 years passed, and I find myself, to my great surprise, giving the Evans Wentz lecture. So it's nice to come full circle, so to speak. Now I'll turn to my actual topic. I want to cover a couple of topics of background information. Some of this will be, I'm afraid, quite familiar to some of you, but I think not to all of you, so I think it might be worth the time to fill in the background on two topics raised in my title. The first topic is Bamiyan, and the second topic, which I'll speak about in a minute, is the Buddhist canons. So now I've emphasized the Bamiyan part of my topic. I think Bamiyan, the city in eastern Afghanistan, is now more or less familiar to everyone, but let's look at the map anyway. This is to give you a general geographical bearings of northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent and eastern Afghanistan. The border here, and location of Bamiyan is circled in red, as you can see. And this is, of course, probably a very familiar image from Bamiyan, and this is what happened in 2001. I think everyone knows about this, and this is the result afterwards. I will not bother to preach about that, what happened there, under the auspices of the Taliban. I think the pictures speak for themselves. My point is that there's much more to Bamiyan than these Buddhas and their destruction. I think the whole world knows about this. The whole world still does not know about the other side of Bamiyan, namely the discovery of thousands, literally thousands of Buddhist fragments of Buddhist manuscripts found in or around Bamiyan, dating back to as old as nearly 2,000 years. And that, of course, will be my main subject tonight. This is a group of caves, one of many in the Bamiyan area, which is believed to be the original place where most of these manuscripts were discovered, although the details are unfortunately not well attested. I'll show you now a couple of examples of these, some of the manuscripts Buddhist manuscripts that have been discovered at Bamiyan. These are just to whet your appetite, so to speak. I'll show you quite a few more later on. This is a very early manuscript of one of the fundamental texts of Mahayana Buddhism, probably familiar to many, if not all of you. This is a manuscript, part of the larger section of these large group of manuscripts written in Sanskrit and in the Brahmi script. Later on, I'll be focusing on the other side of the collection, the earliest set. The earlier manuscripts, which are in Kharoshthi script and Gandhari language. So this is just a preliminary taste of the larger set of material. Another important find from a somewhat later date from this huge cache of Bamiyan manuscripts is this Vajradchedika, which has been translated by my esteemed host. I'll come back, as I said, to more manuscripts later on. Now I want to say a few words of background about the Buddhist canon, and here I've emended the text a little, and I've added Buddhist canons, plural, this being a central topic of what I'll be discussing this evening. People often talk of the Buddhist canon, and typically they speak, or at least used to speak, of the Pali canon, that is the Tipitaka, as it's known, which is often thought of, or used to be thought of in the scholarly world, and I think to some extent is still thought of in the popular view as the Buddhist canon. But of course we know quite well now that it is not the Buddhist canon, it's a Buddhist canon, one of several or many, and I'll say a few words about that later on, how many perhaps. Really because of the accident of history, more or less, for the most part, the Pali canon, that is to say the canon studied and used in what is broadly called Southern Buddhism, that is Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, is the one which had the best luck, so to speak, throughout history and has been preserved completely and faithfully over more than 2,000 years. But it's become increasingly clear over the last several decades or more, really, of Buddhist studies, and this is ultimately the point of my lecture, that the Pali Canon is simply a Buddhist canon, one of many. The others, most of the others of which have disappeared, been lost completely for the most part. However, in recent decades, we have discovered increasingly large number of fragments of a canon, the canon of the Northwestern world, which I showed you in the map previously, which had been previously lost, thought to be completely lost. I want to say a few words about the nature of these canons and specifically how they are preserved, or, as is often the case, lost. This is an image which will certainly be familiar to many of you. This is a typical example of a palm leaf manuscript of the Pali Canon, and this is the traditional mode of preservation and transmission of these canonical texts. This doesn't happen to be, it's chosen as an example of a subpart of the canon called the Anguttara Nikaya, which is the class of literature that I'll be focusing on this evening. So that's your first introduction to it. This is an example of another way in which Buddhist canons are preserved. There is, in the Buddhist tradition, a long-standing sense of concern or anxiety, what I refer to as Dharma anxiety, the fear that the Dharma, that is to say, the words of the Buddha, or what we call the Buddhist canon, will be lost, forgotten, and disappear. So various topics, various techniques have been developed in order to guarantee the long-term preservation. One of them, a famous example in Burma or Myanmar, as you prefer, was this project to carve the entire canon onto stone slabs. As you see here, that's one side of a slab or stele that's inscribed on both sides, and there are 729 of them covering recording the entire canon. This type of Dharma insurance policy has also been done in other parts of the world. This is another famous example in China, Fangshan Stone Sutra slabs. And this is an example of one of the text on one of those slabs. So these are that by way of a few examples of the different Buddhist canons and the ways in which they are recorded and preserved. I'll now turn back to the Pali Canon, which is always the best place to refer to since it's the best preserved and best documented. So this is the overall structure of the Pali Canon. It's a fairly formidable pile of information for those that are not familiar with it, so I just want to clarify the parts that are particularly relevant to my presentation this evening. The Tipitaka, which, as most of you know, means three baskets, referring to the three main portions of the canon, the Vinaya Pitaka, the monastic laws, the Sutta Pitaka, the sutras, the preachings or teachings of the Buddha, and the Abhidhamma, the analysis of the teachings. So I'll be concerned in talking today about manuscripts from the Sutta Pitaka division, and within that, the 5 divisions of the Sutta Pitaka. The one that I'll be talking about, as I already mentioned, is the Anguttara Nikaya. There are 5 divisions of 5 sets or groups, or perhaps I should say collections of sutras, or suttas as they are known in Pali. The difference being in part content. The contents of these 5 groups are different but not entirely different. Just a considerable extent they are overlapping. So for instance, the Anguttara Nikaya and the one to the left, the Samyutta Nikaya, have a lot of material in common, and some of the others as well. The really distinguishing or unique factor of the Anguttara Nikaya is its method of arrangement. It's arranged by numerical principles, and in the hopes of clarifying that, I've given you here the names of this collection in Pali Anguttara Nikaya and the corresponding collections in other languages, in Sanskrit Ekottarika and so forth. All of these titles, although they are phrased somewhat differently, they all mean something like add one, which is, I've used that as a general rubric. Add one or increase by one, I guess you could translate it. And this refers to the numerical arrangement of this collection. Now, when I say this collection, the Anguttara Nikaya consists of somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 sutras. And the reason that I'm so vague about the numbers is it depends on how you exactly construe the text and how you count the different sutras, and there are minimal versions and expanded versions, so there's a lot of flexibility and complexity. But my point is that it's a huge collection. Most of the individual sutras are quite short. They cover 3 or 4 or 5 pages in print, but when you add the whole thing up, it becomes quite colossal. So let me clarify, and still by way of background, that this collection is preserved in complete form in Pali, in a complete translation in Chinese, which, however, is very different from the Pali version for complicated, problematic reasons that I'm not going to discuss. That's not my main point. But we have some fragments of it, fairly small number of fragments of it, in Sanskrit discovered in Central Asia. And we have now a certain number, you'll see how much later on, rather small, but significant, in Gandhari. The significance of this Ad 1 is the following. The text as a whole is divided into 11 sections, as you see at the bottom of the slide. And so these sections from 1 to 11 consist of, let's say, for example, the groups, say the fourth section. The fourth section of this huge collection will consist of several hundred, at least, sutras in which somehow the number 4 is significant. So typically, it'll start out, the Buddha said to the monks, there are 4 kinds of such and such, 4 things that you should practice, or 4 things that you should surrender or abandon. And then you go on to the 5s, and there will be sutras talking about 5 items. So that's the sense of the term Ad 1 collection. Each section, each of the 11 sections talks about an increasing number of topics, beginning with 1 and going on into the 11s. The other point I wanted to make about this image is that the enterprise here, the underlying enterprise, is discovering and comparing and analyzing the relationships and differences and commonalities between these 2 versions. This is what Buddhist scholars of a certain stripe spend most of their time doing. And why do we do that? Well, keeps us busy, but more importantly, I want to emphasize that the difference between these collections in different languages and different Buddhist traditions are quite significant and sometimes massive. I already mentioned that the Chinese is shockingly different from the Pali for reasons that I won't go into. So that's the enterprise, and my angle on this is that we now have substantial pieces of the Gandhari, so another piece of the puzzle to deal with. This is an example of a sutra from the 9th of the 11 sections of the Anguttara Nikaya, and this will be my sample text for reasons that will become clear later. So it starts off with the Buddha speaking to one of his disciples or students, Meghiya, and explaining how to enable yourself to ripen your mind. The background story on this is that the beginning of the sutra, which I haven't quoted here, Meghiya is a young disciple, and he's walking around and he sees this beautiful spot in the forest, and he says, this would be a great place to meditate. And he sits down and meditates in this peaceful forest, and no matter how hard he tries, instead of properly meditating, he starts thinking about nasty things. He has cruel and lustful thoughts. There's a commentary on this text which explains the problem is that in his previous lives, for 500 previous lives, he was a king, and all day he would be saying, off with their heads, and killing and torturing prisoners. And then in the evening, after a day's work, the dancing girls would come in, and then he would amuse himself and say, it's good to be the king. And this left mental traces, karmic memories in his mind, so that he couldn't focus on his meditation. And he went to see the Buddha and said, what am I doing wrong? And the Buddha said, you're getting ahead of yourself. You're not at a state of mental or spiritual development to do this kind of solitary meditation. And this is what you have to do. And then he lists these 5 preliminary exercises or developments that this guy Mejia needs to do. And he goes through the first, most important to have a good friend, and then to learn the virtues, and to listen to proper talk, educational discussions, and so forth, and the 4th and the 5th. And then he says in the last paragraph, once you've got those 5 conditions, then there are 4 more habits that you have to develop, or meditational practices. And just in case the point is not obvious, I've done the math for you. 5 plus 4 equals 9, and that's why this sutra is the 3rd sutra in the group of the 9s in the Anguttara Nikaya. That's all more or less background, and now I turn to my real major topic, the last part of my title, The Retrieving a Lost Buddhist Canon. And this is what we're retrieving from. This is one of the pages of a notebook of manuscript fragments from Bamiyan, which are in the collection of Mr. Magnus Keien in Norway. And the job is to sort through these thousands and thousands of fragments and try to make some sense of them. These fragments belong, and I mentioned this previously, before we were looking at the bulk of the collection, which is in Sanskrit and Brahmi, and that's the later part of the collection dating from 3rd to 7th centuries. Would you go with that? But there's a smaller but earlier group dating from probably 1st to 3rd century, which is in the Gandhari language and the Khroshti script. This represents a stage of development in the history of Buddhist literature when the local vernaculars were still being preferred for the recitation and transmission and explanation of the texts. The Buddha is said to have commanded his disciples. There was a question about what is the appropriate language, and he said, speak to people in your own language. And this was taken as a principle that Buddhism became a language of translation. Later on, for reasons that I won't go into, the Buddhists adopted the Sanskrit language, which theoretically the Buddha had told them not to use. But we're talking about this early stage in which the local vernaculars were still in use. And my point being that more and more we're finding that, in fact, there seems to have been a great deal of material and probably a complete canon in the Gandhari language at the period that I'm discussing, the first 2 or 3 centuries of the Common Era. These are the smallest fragments, and it's not all that bad. It gets a little better. These are some better examples. These are actually the biggest fragments. Some of them are as big as maybe a third of a complete folio. These are long palm leaf folios. They're probably about this long, this wide originally. So the first one shows you as bad as it gets. This shows you about as good as it gets. And finally, coming to the point, it says here in the caption, the upper fragment is part of the Ekotrikagama. Ekotrikagama, that is the Ad 1 collection that I've been talking about, what's called Anguttara in Pali. That's before. So Anguttara is the same as Ekottara. So now we have some fragments, and not coincidentally, the fragment that I just showed you is the one of the sutra which corresponds to the Pali Sutra, the Meghiya Sutta that I cited before. And here I've put in red the actual part of that fragment that you just saw corresponding to this part of the translation. This is now a detail of that first fragment that I showed you before. You just saw the recto, the front side, Here you have both the front and back, recto and verso. And I've bolded 3 letters which say Mekia. And this was actually not the first clue, but one of the first clues at which it became clear to us that in fact we have fragments of this major section of the Buddhist canon, that is to say the Anguttara or Ekottara Agama. When I say us or we, I'm not being cute or editorial. I'm referring to a subset of the Kharoshthi Club, now known as the Gang of Four, which was the group who were particularly involved in the discovery and decipherment and publication in the not too near future of this material. So I just want to make it clear that I'm presenting the results of a cooperative project with myself and 3 of my colleagues and students. The other 3 members of the Gang of Four are Chanida Tantrasrisalai, Tim Lenz, and Lin Chen. This all started in February 1912. 2012. Sorry. When actually Tim and Chanida were sort of subcommittee studying some of these fragments and first realized, in fact, that this and 1 or 2 of the others had this intriguing connection with the Ekottara, and then working with this, which is the biggest of the fragments by far, it rapidly became clear that this Mekia corresponds to the Meghiya of the Pali Sutra. In retrospect, it couldn't be more obvious. At the time, it was not obvious at all. This key word was not bolded and marked out in red. That had to be done. But here we are. This is something to give you an idea of the nature of the correspondences and also maybe something for the specialists. Here you have the Gandhari text, the corresponding Pali, and the English translation. So the bold is the part of the Gandhari text that's actually preserved on the second line, the line that with the highlighted name. And then in the Pali, I've given you the full sentence with the corresponding part in bold, and similarly in English. So you can see, I think, even if you're not an expert, you can see how the Gandhari and the Pali are pretty closely related, but also interestingly different. And then a specific example, a particular word to show you the correspondences. This is the word corresponding, meaning to or for the maturation. Paripagaye in Gandhari, Paripakaya in Pali. And the Pali specialist will probably notice that there's something wrong with the word Paripakaya, and it should be Paripakaya, but it's not. This is not a typo. I just wanted to put that on the record. It's one of the problems and mysteries of the Pali text. So I just covering myself. I'm aware there's something strange there. I'm not going to try to explain it. So at this point, we knew of at least 1 and at this point maybe a couple of other fragments that seem to belong to a manuscript of this fundamental sutra collection, the Ekottara, as we call it. Where did we go from there? Well, here I've added a note to this image that I showed you before, which is more or less a random collection of 6 or 7 fragments of the Gandhari material. And I point out, note the variety of hands. I think it will be obvious, I think you don't have to be an expert to see that the hands of these are very different and distinct. This is a feature of these Gandhari manuscripts, both a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because you have to get used to the sometimes rather idiosyncratic handwritings and styles of the different scribes. But it's a blessing because it's very easy to pick out from these hundreds of fragments which ones were written by the same scribe and which, at least in likelihood, were part of the same manuscripts. This is not always the case in manuscript work. In other manuscript traditions, even later in India, you get a very standardized handwriting, and you often can't, or it's very difficult to tell which fragments belong with which fragments. So what happened was we, the Gang of Four, sorted through these 300 or so fragments, and we found 23 that were quite clearly written by the same scribe as this already identified item. And for nearly all of them, then we could go ahead and compare their contents, sometimes very small, with the other versions of this sutra collection, the Pali and the Chinese mostly, and confirm that nearly all of them were in fact part of this same text or collection, and therefore were presumably part of the same manuscript. Just to show you some of the problems that we ran into, this is a manuscript which is not part of the collection we're talking about. It's something that I happened to see many years ago in Pakistan and tried to take a photograph of, but this is what they look like before they've been conserved and taken care of. Fortunately, I took extensive notes on this, and it turned out that this also belongs to the same manuscript that I'm discussing. But actually, whatever happened to this, I have no idea. It's disappeared. This was another very important clue in the development of our understanding of this material. As you can probably see, this is a fragment, a small fragment of one of these very large folios, but this small fragment itself is cobbled together from 5 of those dreadful micro fragments that I showed you at the beginning. So this was, some of you will understand what the amount of time and labor that it takes to figure this out. They don't just fall into place. But we worked together and we got there. And then we noticed something quite surprising about this fragment. And again, you may be able to notice that, in fact, the verso side and the recto side, the front and the back, are actually in different handwritings. So what this meant is that we had to go back to the drawing board because we'd been selecting the fragments on the basis of common handwriting. At this point, it became clear that this was something like a tag team arrangement and that there were 2 scribes who were probably taking turns. Keep in mind, the entire manuscript would have been literally thousands of folios long, the entire Ekottara manuscript. So we can understand why there were 2 scribes involved. Of course, there might have been more than 2 scribes involved, but we haven't established that. So at that point, we had to go back through this whole material again and get used to the handwriting of the verso and look for other fragments by this scribe. And in fact, we found 2 more by this scribe, which proved to be part of the same collection and which actually had some particularly special importance about our interpretation, even though there were only 2 more added to the 23 that we already had. To explain why those 2 were particularly important, I want to go back to the structure of the Anguttara or Ekottara. Remember, they're 2 names for the same thing. So this shows you a sort of a proportional table of the size of the 11 sections of the entire collection. And at the bottom are the number of pages. This refers to the modern printed edition by the Pali Text Society in 5 volumes totaling about 1,800 pages. The vertical lines above with the little numbers, these are the numbers of the fragments that we found. And they're supposed to give you some sense of what a small fraction of the entire text the entire manuscript that we actually have. And even that is not at all accurate because if those lines, those little black lines above, if they were actually proportional to the entire size of the text, there'd be not little lines but dots that would be so small you couldn't even see them on the screen, so we had to exaggerate. The point I want to make here is that all of the fragments, the 23 fragments that we were working with before, were in the sections 9, 10, and 11. So at that point, it was less than clear or certain or proven, at least, that we were working with a manuscript, what was originally a manuscript of the entire Ekotere Agama. For instance, it could have been a partial manuscript. It's known in later traditions that there would be separate manuscripts of just one section, the 9s or the 4s or the 10s. But my suspicion was that, in fact, that it was part of a complete manuscript. And the importance of those two extra fragments, the ones that were in this other handwriting, is that actually they fit in here in the 6s. So they ended up being renumbered as 1, 2, and 1b. And they're in the 6s right about the middle of the hypothetical entire manuscript. So that made me and my collaborators much more confident that, in fact, we're dealing with a tiny fragment, far less than 1%, of what was originally a complete manuscript of the Anguttara or Ekotere Agama collection, which would have been 2,000 or 3,000 folios, or maybe more than that. The arrangements and arguments for this position, this interpretation, are a little bit complicated and a little bit technical, and I won't go into that. I can say that I've spoken about the subject and discussed it in quite a few venues, and I have the impression that this conclusion has been generally accepted, unless somebody wants to bust my balloon tonight in the discussion, but it seems to be working out. This is a detail of the right half of the previous slide, showing you the second half of the Anguttara Nikaya, just to show you a little more clearly where those bits that we actually have are located, in the middle and the latter part. This shows you some more of the fragments, total 25 fragments that we now have. This is, I think, 9 of the 9 largest. So it gives you an idea of how little actually we have of the entire manuscript. The rest of it is, there's more, but it's only about this much, or actually less than this much. But the distribution and the commonalities with the other manuscripts, as I said, make me pretty confident that this is in fact what we're dealing with. I see that time is flying and it's getting late. I have one last concluding section of my talk, which I'd like to run through. It's called So What? So I'd like to explain why this is important, in my opinion. Well, I like to think it's important for its own sake. It's certainly very exciting to work with these manuscripts and to identify and read something that hasn't been seen for almost 2,000 years. But more broadly, what can this discovery and this kind of discovery tell us about the bigger picture of the history and doctrines of Buddhism, about the history of Buddhist literature, and even, dare I say, about the nature of sacred scriptures in general? Let me back up and talk a little bit about the nature of scriptural canons in Buddhism and in general. If I can talk about religions of the book, and I don't mean the peoples of the book, but books, religions with scripture, with defined scriptural canons, including the Judeo-Christian tradition and Buddhism particularly. The inward view, the internal view of scriptural canons in any of these religions is typically that they have always been there. They're the words of God. They're engraved in stone from the beginning, in some cases literally so. In the case of Buddhism, the traditional orthodox internal view of the faithful would be, well, 2,500 years ago, the Buddha wandered around India, spoke these words of wisdom, spoke these thousands and thousands of sutras. He had his acolyte Ananda, who was always at his side and who wasn't actually very bright, but he had a photographic memory, and he literally remembered every word the Buddha ever said. And after the Buddha died or had nirvana, Ananda repeated every word that he had said for 40 years, and the other monks remembered them. And that is the Buddha Vachana, words of the Buddha, and faithfully preserved without change ever since. Well, of course, academics and scholars and historians would dispute that traditional view, and this is well confirmed that it wasn't that simple, and that in fact canons become fixed, become stable, become defined, become unified at a later stage, typically hundreds of years after the original foundation of the religion. And what we actually find when we look at the documents, and the documents are usually ancient manuscripts, that the period of unity, the Bible, the canon, is preceded by a periods of disunity when the scriptures are very highly variable and unstable. And then at some point in history, in these religions, typically some external force or necessity causes or requires the establishment, the definition of a fixed canon. But on those rare but wonderful occasions when we find ancient manuscripts, we typically find variety, diversity, rather than consistency. In the case of Buddhism, this is particularly clear because, as I said, Buddhism is is a religion of translation, and partly for that reason, partly because Buddhism spread widely and relatively rapidly through the Indian world and then beyond the Indian world through Asia, it's only natural and hardly surprising that the scriptures should actually show considerable or sometimes great diversity. Another issue, excuse me, another issue particularly in the history of the Buddhist canon is the notion of the written canon. It's well known that for a certain period, a period of probably several centuries after the time of the Buddha, that the Buddhist scriptures were preserved by oral recitation and memorization. At a later period, which is believed to be about the 1st century BC, Buddhist communities began using writing for the scriptures, again as a kind of insurance policy to preserve the Dharma. So at this point, somewhere between the 1st century BC and for the following 2, 3, or 4 centuries, there's a gradual shift from oral tradition to written tradition. And this is presumably related in complicated ways that I won't try to explain, but presumably related to the process of the fixation and the definition of a closed canon. The particular importance or interest of this manuscript in this respect is this is the first time that we have in this Gandhari tradition, we'll call Buddhism of the Northwest, a manuscript of a complete sutra collection. There are numerous other examples of manuscripts of a single sutra or of a small collection of sutras, but this is the first time where we have with reasonable certainty a complete, or the remnants of a complete manuscript of one of these major subsets of the canon as a whole. So they seem to represent, this seems to represent something of a turning point in the history of the canon in the Northwest, the last stage of development of written as opposed to purely oral canons. If we compare the contents of this Ekottara with its semi-parallels in Pali, in Sanskrit, and particularly in Chinese. I gave you just a brief sample of that before. We find, as usual, a broad parallelism, but very considerable differentiation in the details, for instance, in the ordering and sequence of the sutras, which is a complex, interesting subject that I don't have time to go into. But we find typically that it's a kind of cut and paste relationship. Maybe if you compare the material in the Gandhari and the Pali, it maybe has a 90% correspondence, 90% of it is the same or more or less similar, but the arrangement sometimes is quite different. The ordering it can be quite different. This brings me to really my last point. I guess I should make my last point. So bear with me a few more minutes. Peter Skilling, who's one of the major authorities, in my opinion, on these kinds of subjects, likes to use the phrase many Buddhisms. There was, as I said at the beginning of my talk, in earlier stages of the understanding of history of Buddhism in the modern times, there was a sense that there was original Buddhism as represented by the Pali Canon, and then some offshoots or degenerations or corruptions of that. That theory is now, I think, safely buried, at least in the academic world. I'm not sure in the general public and in the minds of the faithful there are different opinions, but this is now, I think I can safely say, scholarly consensus. The idea, Peter Skilling's notion of many Buddhisms being that, in fact, Buddhism was very localized in different parts of India and later beyond India, that the local traditions had their own take, their own material, and quite possibly their own canons developing separately. And this is now one of our best examples from the early period of something that really backs up the idea, which I've been leaning more and more towards over the years, that in fact there was a separate canon in Gandhara, in the Gandhari language. I believe that they had a complete canon of texts, and at least, and probably most or all of them were written down at the period that I'm talking about. Most of them have been lost. So at the beginning I said that the Pali Canon looms large through what are really accidents of history and geography. The Pali Canon survives because it happens to be the canon of the parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia where Buddhism survived. So it was simply handed on and remembered and recopied through the centuries. We now are lucky enough to have pieces, small pieces, but significant pieces of another canon at the opposite end of the Indian Buddhist world in the far northwest, which has survived for another reason. It survived basically for two reasons. One is because these materials are found in northern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan, which is beyond the area of the Indian monsoon climate, which, if you've ever lived there, you know is very damaging to any organic material such as birch bark or palm leaf or your socks. Simply don't let. There is no monsoon in this area. That's one factor. The other factor is that for whatever reasons, the Buddhists in this area had an idea, a principle that scriptures should be ritually buried, as is the case in many religious traditions. In this case, it might have been part of the Buddhist, what I call the Dharma insurance policy, to bury the scriptures and save them through the centuries and millennia, which seems to have worked. So by another accident of history and geography, the Gandhari canon has survived, at least in some small fragments, and this, I think, is the tip of the iceberg, but we'll never see the iceberg. I think in many parts of India there would have been regional canons in various local vernacular languages, that is to say Prakrit dialects. We have some hints or clues of that. I think there's no chance that we'll ever actually find that material, but I think the rediscovery of a canon in Gandhari, which I think has now taken place, is a strong indication that there was, at one point in ancient history, there were many canons of many Buddhisms, as Peter Skilling would put it. So I thank you for your attention. That's all I need to say.
Do you think that the absence of fragments from section 7 and 8 is just, as you say, an accident of history? Or can you think of some reason, maybe perhaps how they were stored, why that would be?
No, I don't really have a good answer for that. I think it's just the luck of the draw. There is a pattern. A lot of manuscripts, Gandhari manuscripts, ones that I haven't talked about, very typically you get the beginning of the manuscript and then the rest of it is missing. We don't know exactly why. Maybe the rest of it, maybe they were never completed. But in this case, it was just the opposite, except for those additional ones. And the fact that we had material from the end, 9, 10, 11, was one of the reasons that I thought it's very likely that it was part of the complete manuscript. If it were from the 1s, 2s, and 3s, I would have doubted it. In fact, as it happens, and I think not just coincidentally, the Sanskrit fragments of the Ekotrikagama are almost all, if I remember correctly, from 1s and the Torfan, not the other ones. The Torfan fragments are, I think, all or nearly all from the 1s and the 2s. And that's a typical pattern. And then you could think, well, those were not complete manuscripts. But the fact that it's from the end, and then the fact that we found some from the middle, was really influenced my thinking. But why 6s, 9s, 10s, 11s, and not the others? I think it's just accidents. Maybe they're out there somewhere to be discovered. Yes, please.
Two questions. First of all, this place in Bamiyan, was this an archive accessible to the only inner circle, or masses could get access to these documents? And how did they transmit this information to the masses? Because we know that the ordinary guy probably could never read this manuscript.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we can only guess at that because these things were not discovered in situ. They were not found in the course of archaeological discovery. They were found by people unknown and passed around. So we can only guess and extrapolate from what we do know. I think it's pretty safe to guess these were the contents of some sort of monastic library. No, it was not a public library, but I think they were accessible in a certain sense that some of them, probably, maybe not all of them, but some of them, I'm thinking of the Tim's Avadana manuscripts, were used for teaching purposes. So maybe people would come to the monastery and a monk would read and explain the text to a group of maybe mostly not literate audience. That was your first question, and what was the second question?
How could the masses, how could they transmit to the masses?
Oh, yeah, well, that's what I'm saying, by oral means. And I've read like Paul Griffiths and studies of Buddhist teachings that are attested in modern times, and it's very typical that a master would hold a manuscript and maybe not read it, but explain it just with the actual. But I think that exactly where these things were and why they were there, we just can't know that. But I think these were either parts of a monastic library, or in some cases they might have been, as I said, these ritually buried old manuscripts. Yeah, John?
Is there textual evidence for monastic libraries in India?
No, I just made it up. Not that I'm aware of, not explicit references.
What would have been the impulse in the first century to write down?
I'm sorry, I think the microphone's not working.
What, can you hear me now?
Yeah, a little bit.
What would have been the impulse in the first century or so to write down?
Oh, okay, yeah.
And it's like this is happening in the Christian world.
Yeah. Well, there's a record in Mahavamsa, that there was a text. I think it was the Nidesa, and there were in a particular community there was only one monk who actually still knew the text by heart, and so this is kind of a semi-mythical explanation, but it probably reflects the overall development. So it was decided that to write that down, and then by extension to write the entire text. I mean, it seems strange to us because that's how we assume that things are preserved. You write them down, you put them in the library, but that was not the Indian cultural tradition. Was that things were learned by memorization. I think, and this is just a speculation of mine, that perhaps the reason that written materials were devalued and sort of distrusted was precisely what I said before, that they were so fragile and they tended to decay so quickly in the Indian climate that it was considered a inferior or secondary mode. But that value changed, and once there was this impulse allegedly for that reason, they started writing it down, originally, I guess, as what I call the kind of insurance policy, and then it became, it took on a life of its own. But it remained, and even nowadays, Buddhist tradition is as much oral as it is written. Excuse me. Yes?
So where are these fragments? Are they in Washington, or did you go to Afghanistan?
No, neither. The fragments that I'm talking about are in a private collection in Norway. So much easier and more pleasant working conditions. So yeah, these things have sort of scattered to the winds, in some cases I'm afraid literally, but they've been acquired by various collectors in Europe, in Japan.
There must
Yeah.
be considerable art to getting them whether they can be flattened down and read instead of,
Yeah,
that's
that.
an example,
Yeah.
comes out of some jar or some, who knows?
Yeah. I let the experts take care of that. These manuscripts are on palm leaf, which is actually a relatively durable material, even though you might not think of it from how it looks, but palm leaf is quite tough, and I don't know exactly how they flatten that out, but it can be done without damaging it. A lot of these manuscripts are in birch bark, which is a much more problematic, very difficult and extremely fragile material. But that's another story. They don't look nearly as nice as this. Yeah, please.
So this predates the Daphne texts, the ones that are written on Daphne paper?
On which?
Daphne,
Daphnia, I don't know
is
if
that the name of the plant, the root, the poison fruit?
from where?
No, they're found
Yeah, usually Tibetan people.
yeah, so that's afterwards?
I would imagine that would be much later. Well, I don't know, because I don't know that the entire body, the Gandhari manuscripts in general, range from, I think we'd say 1st century BC to 3rd century AD. This material is from the later part, so these are I'm guessing late 2nd century AD. That's all I can tell you on that. Yeah.
So you talked about some of the structural differences among the different canons, but I was curious whether there's indication of differing practices among the sects, particular sects that was active in the Bamiyan area, whether it's distinct from numerous other Theravadan sects. And also I'm curious whether there was Mahayana presence in Central Asia, and specifically in Afghanistan as well. And whether, I know like in southern Tajikistan, the huge lying Buddha was found there, and I want to know whether that was all Theravadan, and also what languages the scriptural texts were using in those areas.
Okay, I'll try to briefly answer. There were several interesting questions there. Well, I mean, I think you said what their practices were. I can't really say much or anything about their practices. What I can talk about is what they wrote and read. So we can talk about their doctrines. The key word there is Mahayana. There are many strata in Buddhist scripture. This material resembles the Theravadan scriptures, the Pali scriptures, but that doesn't make it Theravadan. It's, I'm not going to say the H word here, but these are, what do we say? What's the politically correct? Mainstream?
Buddhism or Shravakaya.
Okay. Paul says it must be good. So it's Buddhism other than Mahayana, of which Theravada is one major sub-school, the one that survived. But so this is, and this sort of material that parallels the Pali Canon, this is neither Mahayana nor not Mahayana. It's mainstream, it's common material that I think all schools of Buddhism, at least at that time, would have shared in common and studied and had, or at least paid respects to. As far as, now in mainstream Buddhism, there are traditionally said to be 18 schools, of which Theravada is one out of 18, but the one that won, so to speak. So we don't really know. These could belong to Mahasanghika, if I had to guess. We have other scriptures from Gandhara, approximately the same material, same period, which in some cases definitely belong to the Dharmaguptaka school and several other possibilities. So we know that there were at least, and then we know from inscriptions there were at least 5 or 6 of these mainstream schools, including Sarvastivadins, which were prevalent in this area and in the early centuries. But then there is Mahayana, yes. Among the material from Bamiyan, and I'm again talking about the early stratum because that's what I'm focusing on, the first, second, third centuries mostly. We have found several small, tantalizing fragments of Mahayana sutras to be continued. But we have 3, at least, fragments of at least 3 Mahayana sutras, so mixed in somehow with this material. So we can see that Mahayana was coexisting with mainstream Buddhism in a way that we don't completely understand. But I think the consensus is they were not split into 2. There wasn't a Mahayana and the others as it appears or as it comes to be in later Buddhism. Much quoted in this connection is the remark by the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who was in this area centuries later, in the 7th century, and he noted, and I think a little with surprise, that these Mahayana, and then I think he used the H word, so I'm quoting, Hinayana monks living together in the same monastery in harmony. And we see that among these manuscripts, they are mixed together. So that bifurcation apparently institutional bifurcation had not taken place. Did I answer some of your
Yeah,
questions?
absolutely. Yeah, thanks a lot. And I'm curious whether the text found further north in Central Asia, present-day Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, are from a similar era and have a similar doctrine.
I'm not aware of manuscripts from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. There are manuscripts from Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. Well, there are inscriptions, but there have been a lot of, a huge body of Sanskrit Buddhist manuscripts were found in what's now Xinjiang, part of China. There were some manuscripts in Turkmenistan, which I believe are Sarvastivadin Vinaya manuscripts. The Sarvastivada seems, broadly speaking, seems to have been the prevalent school, dominant school in Inner Asia, Central Asia. Yes?
I'm just wondering if there are any non-Buddhist materials in that ritual burials and traditions. There wouldn't be, right?
Yeah. There are a few examples among all of this material, and I guess I should clarify when I say all of this material, I mean Buddhist manuscripts in Gandhari, which have all been discovered within the last 20 years, and this is now in the hundreds, not full manuscripts, but fragments, sometimes very small fragments of text, well over 100. There are one or two texts that are not explicit, well, really only one that I can think of in the Bajor collection, which is what's called Niti Shastra. It's a non-religious text. It's kind of something like Proverbs, like Book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, if you're familiar with that. It's a little bit similar to that in Sanskrit, called Niti Shastra. And this is sort of common study, common educational material. It's neither Buddhist nor non-Buddhist. That's an interesting clue. It shows something about their educational system. But there are no manuscripts that are, say, Hindu or Brahmanical or Jain as opposed to Buddhist. No, not at all.
Is there any way to speculate about the relationship between writing in India in general and Buddhism? I mean, or we just don't have early manuscripts from the subcontinent itself?
Well, now we do. I mean, I'm thinking back to the question that was asked earlier about why did the Buddhists start writing. The reluctance to write scriptures is something that apparently predates Buddhism. There's this traditional value that the Vedic scriptures were not supposed to be written down, and sometimes stated as an absolute prohibition. It's a sin to write down the Vedas. And that can be variously interpreted. Some people interpret that as a kind of conspiracy, keeping the monopoly in the hands of the priestly class. I think that's a little bit probably oversimplified. And I said before that deep in the cultural tradition, there was a sense that writing was a subsidiary and maybe inferior type of knowledge. And there are many references to people who hide their scholars, pundits, who hide their manuscripts because you weren't supposed to have them. It implied that you didn't know your stuff very well. It could well be the case, I don't think it's proven, it could well be the case that the Buddhists who came from that tradition, that cultural tradition, but were building their own way. I think it's very plausible that it was the Buddhists who first started the practice of writing scriptures, writing them down, and that may have affected or simulated imitation in the Brahmanical tradition, but that's speculative. Did you have a question, or are you just... Oh, sorry.
Which would you like to talk about the radiocarbon dating of some of this?
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't remember the numbers. This particular material, these fragments that I've been talking about, have not been dated, but some of the other pretty similar material from Bamiyan, the Gandhari material from Bamiyan, have been carbon dated, and it's a little bit complicated. Radiocarbon dating is not like you read in the newspaper. It gives you sort of broad ranges of probability. But basically it came down to these manuscripts, this group in general, should be somewhere between the 2nd and early 4th century AD. And that fits in with other evidence, historical evidence and parallels in inscriptions. You know, I tend to put this in the earlier stage because it's non-Sanskritized. You see in the later stage, say the 3rd century, this movement towards Sanskrit is starting, and you get texts that are sort of halfway Sanskritized Gandhari, and that, you know, to my mind, is a characteristic of the later stuff. So that's why I guess that this is second half of 2nd century, but plus or minus. Yeah.
Is there an indication that the Taliban destroyed manuscripts as well, or was it just the statues?
Well, we don't really know what happened. I've never heard of the Taliban or, you know, anyone say targeted manuscripts particularly. I mean, the issue from their point of view is that you know, images are offensive. What they call boot. In Persian they call boot, which means graven image, that thing. But it actually is, historically, it's the word Buddha, which is a loan word into Iranian languages, ironically. Something like this, I think they wouldn't bother. I mean, you know what happened not just there, but in the Kabul Museum, where there was intentional destruction of all the statuary. So. I hope that didn't happen. I can't know for sure.
Well, if there are no further
Okay.
questions, I'd like to thank our speaker not only for the talk, but also for the incredible work which he's done and led others in doing to recover not just this material particularly, but, you know, much older material as well, which has really revolutionized our understanding of Buddhism in the last decade or two. So I'd like you to thank him for that as well.